So first off, before we get going, my name is, of course, Tim Medin. I am a principal consultant here at Red Siege, and have been doing things here, running the show for almost coming up on 3 years now. Lead instructor for the SANS pen testing course, SANS 560, of course, teach that, as well as the advanced pen testing course. IANS faculty, SANS MSISE program director, that's the master's program, and have been pen testing for a long time. So enough with that. Let's get rip and roaring here. So I'm gonna give you sort of an overview on what we're gonna talk about here. By the way, the slides are up. They should be up already at redsiege.com/AB1. If you want to grab those, grab screenshots, whatever, it's a little bit easier that way. But it kind of broke this down into 4 pieces. Now there's, as we mentioned, there's a second part. Mike is going to go into a little bit more technical depth here as a continuation of this, because we just don't have time to cover it all in this one webcast. So that is going to be on August 18th. Keep an eye out for that. Mike is fantastic, wicked smart, going to bring some goodness there. But this presentation is broken up into 4 pieces. So we're going to walk through here. We're sort of presenting a better idea and why assumed breach is a better idea than your traditional pen test. But let's take a look at the data, right? You can say that something is better, but is it, right? Let's take a look at some of our assumptions, the traditional pen tests, what's going on in the real world, and then sort of come up with a solution that kind of addresses all of those various questions, right? So the first piece we're going to talk about is our traditional pen test. What are we doing with our traditional pen test, right? What have we always been doing? So here we've got our traditional pen test, right? A good old clip from, anybody know the reference here in our chat? Takes a couple seconds here, but I'm sure someone's going to get this, if not everybody. But in our traditional pen test, right, what are some of the things that we do? Yes, wrong answers only, please, for this. This is not war games. Give us any other answer. 42, I like it. So in our traditional pen test, our internal pen test, we plug into the network, right? We start off with a laptop test tool, I liked, nice, with a system on the internal network, right? It's on the internal network, and then we perform some of our testing. And then traditionally, we use that connectivity and we start a scan, right? Fire up the vulnerability, start the NNAP, whatever scanner it might be, to identify ports, services, and vulnerability. And then from there, in a traditional sort of pen test, we map those ports, map those vulnerabilities to exploits, press go, and then likely some password guessing here as well. Now, given these 3 things, right, we start off with our access, we do our scan, we do this exploitation, right? If we're going to map this back to the real world, what are the assumptions that make this a valid test, right? Given X, what has to be true, right? So if an attacker is going to plug into the internal it can be connected to the internal network, the assumption is if we are doing our pen test from this perspective, it assumes that the attacker has a device on the network. Right now, when you take a step back, I don't know about you, but for me, when I take a step back, I'm like, wait a second, okay. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, that could happen. Yeah, but is it the likely scenario? Again, we'll come back to some more of this, but it means the attacker has to have the device on the network. So think about, attacking some local business, right? Or it doesn't have to be a local business, but a local office. That means the attacker has to have some sort of proximity. The proverbial attacker in Iran, Russia, I'm going to pick on ejection here in Pakistan, call him a call out. Right, it doesn't matter. Wherever they are, that's not going to have proximity to walk into that facility and plug in the device, right? It also assumes when we start a pen test, we don't have credentials. So somehow they've got this local access, but they don't have credentials, right? You see these assumptions here, and it's sort of how they sort of tend to fall apart, right? From there we go and scan, right? So we start our scanner. Now the question is this reasonable? Are the attackers getting access to our network and then running scans? A little bit less so, right? And then of course our exploitation, right? We're gonna do our exploitation with a known exploit, right? And our password is an escalation and pivot. We have to fight to get that first level of access, right? So given our assumptions that in our pen test, because we're doing these steps and we're mapping back to a real world attacker, we can sort of see that our traditional test here, where I plug in, where I scan, and where I exploit, doesn't necessarily map back to sort of the real world scenarios, right? So let's take it that sort of step back now, right? So when we plug into the network, if the attacker is starting with this, how is the attacker getting on the network in the first place? Right? If this is a valid assumption, when and where is this happening? Right? How often is this going to be happening? Is this the predominant way? If I'm doing my pen test, I would like to have it be not only as realistic as possible, but cover as many of the real world or the more likely scenarios. And this kind of isn't the case, right? Are the attackers running these noisy scans? I haven't heard of any IR people saying, you know what, the bad guy got in and fired up a vulnerability scanner. Kind of doubt that, right? They're going to be a little bit quieter than that. And ideally, you would notice a unauthorized vulnerability scanner on your network. Accessing the step 3 here, our exploit. Are the attackers lobbing exploits everywhere? Not really, right? There's so many ways where we can get access to data because it's quite literally littered all over the place. In fact, Mike and I, we were on a call yesterday with a client, and we were just talking through this exact scenario. And we were talking through this scenario on possible detections, because this is a very red assumed breach we were talking about with a client. And they were talking through possible detections of, if we have access as a valid user, how are we going to find if that user accesses the data they're supposed to, in a way, have access to, right? We'll come back to that in a little bit more and talk through some of the technical pieces here as well, right? And then for a traditional pen test, our initial access is oftentimes with this exploit. Of course, we don't see that many remote code execution these days. Or our password is our initial access, right? Now, the attackers, are they essentially starting with access? Do they need to get that first guess to get on the network, right? And so we can sort of see that a lot of these assumptions kind of fall apart if we look at this. So let's talk now. So we talked through our traditional test. Let's talk through a little bit about what the attackers are actually doing. So what I ended up doing is I went through a couple of different resources. You know, everyone loves the Verizon data breach report, right? So I went through the Verizon data breach report, and in the report we saw that 70% of the attackers were insiders, 30% were, did I say that right? 70% outsiders, 30% insiders. Now, in the report, they actually acknowledged that the insiders might be a little bit high because it counts things like data leak, right? Where someone has access to the data and they make a mistake. Oftentimes a little bit easier to see as well, but regardless, you can see here, even if these numbers are off by a little bit, there's a decent number of these things that are happening with an insider. Now, an insider versus an outsider, the difference is the insider starts with permission, right? We're almost at like 1 in 3 cases here where the attacker, right, the bad guy here is someone inside who is supposed to have access. Maybe not access to that data, but access to some data, some resources, right? So good case here to say, you know what, maybe we start with access, right? So if we take a look once again at the 2020 report, what's weird about these reports is every year the format seems to change just a little bit. So some of the data is a little bit weird to correlate from year to year. But regardless, we see here, this year they fortunately made this section a little bit easier to read, but the top threat actions for in the 2020 report were 1, phishing, 2, use of stolen creds. Right, so in both cases here, the attacker is essentially starting with access. Right, if you've got stolen creds, I mean, those are credentials, those work, those allow me to access things. Phishing, right? If this payload lands, they are starting with access. Now, some of you are saying, well, that's not the start. That's sort of maybe a point of discussion. A great thing, Carlos Perez, Dark Operator, he's got the tagline on his website that says, shell is only the beginning. And that's what we're kind of going with here. That phishing, that's where it starts, right? So here's an interesting quote here. It's not what's in the top that's interesting. We already know social phishing and hacking use of stolen credentials are a good way to start a breach. What they're calling out in the report is, yes, these are the obvious starting points. Right, and if we kind of map that back to our traditional pen test, we don't sort of start with either. In fact, we focus on very different things. We're focusing on network services, right? Internal network services at that, which would assume that the attacker somehow has access to the network, but doesn't have credentials. It's sort of the opposite of this. This is the case where the attacker has credentials, but doesn't have access to the systems, or sorry, network connectivity to the systems. It's sort of a weird reversal, if you will. Some more look at the top threat actions. We can see here that phishing has always been towards the top. The use of stolen credentials always been up there. Well, increased the last few years. Big target for the attackers here. Now, of course, we harp on phishing all the time, right? Phishing's going up. And if you're working from home now, a lot of you probably weren't working from home at the start of the year, and now you are. And there are some very specific phishes associated with that, and we're seeing more and more click-throughs with things like this, right? Now, you don't have to be, you're never gonna have a phishing campaign where no one clicks, right? We can see the example here. This is an older report. They didn't seem to publish anything like this that I saw in the 2019 or 2020, but the results here that in any given campaign, 4% click on at least one link, right? And associated with that, it says phished, so it's even sort of beyond that. There was additional actions. If someone inside your organization has a good phish, someone will probably give up some of those credentials, right? You're never going to have that perfection. Of course, me as the attacker, I don't need all of the accounts. I need that one starting sort of foothold. The heck's a foothold? Foothold to get rolling. Another great topic here. This is a great blog by the FireEye folks, where they talk through a scenario of a likely, well, real world scenario. So they phish, pivot to the network. They actually called out curb roasting, kind of give them a shout out for that. Use that for an elevation of privileges, and then start going after some of the targets here as well. Right, so going back to the attackers here, we're starting with access, right? We see with credentials, we are literally starting with that access. With phishing, we land on a system with that access, which when we compare that back to our traditional pen test and the assumptions that have to be true to make the pen test representative of a real world attack, which is pretty obvious, we've got a misalignment, right? Now, additionally, one thing that's important here is with our traditional internal test, oftentimes we've got a little bit of misfocus, right? The important thing in any test is always to focus on the business risk. In fact, I always tell my guys, whenever I teach a course, I beat this into people over and over again. Ask the target, what is your most critical data or process, critical data or process, right? What of these data or process, if lost, stolen, leaked, or destroyed, would have the greatest impact to your organization? And it's important to stay focused on that. Because when we're doing our test, if we end up trying to get to domain admin, which we most often refer to that as, quote, winning, right? It's actually a little bit misguided, because the data is the important piece. Technically, if I give an attacker domain admin, they are still one step away from the data. They have to still be able to go move and pivot and access the data. And if we focus on that elevation to get domain admin, we as pen testers might actually get caught a little bit sooner. Or we may go on a path where there's much simpler ways to access some of that data, right? And what data is important to you and your organization is going to vary greatly. It could be, credit card information, financials, PII, intellectual property, right? There's any number of things that could be important to your organization. And it's always important to ask, right? I had the donkey a little bit before, right? When you assume, right, you make the ass out of you and me. Never assume. Always ask the dumb question. In fact, I frame it like this. I can guess, but I really don't like to be wrong. So if you wouldn't mind, would you describe to me what data or process, if lost, stolen, or damaged, would have the greatest impact to your organization? And I'll tell you what, 99 times out of 100, I'm right, right? I'm right. Like if I go after a bank, like it's going to be, financial information. Okay, cool. But I want to ask, because I had one test a number of years ago where it was a sort of, think of it like Amazon, but for tools. So they had tools. They had like this giant warehouse where you could order a bunch of tools. They had this wrench that was like a meter long, and I'm like, oh, cool. Can I get that wrench? And they're like, that'll be $987, Tim. I was like, I'm not going to get that wrench. But anyways, so I asked him this question, right? Ed Scotus, my mentor, had beat that into me over and over again. Ask that question, Tim. And I'm like, all right, I'll ask the stupid question. And I asked the question, and I got an answer I did not expect, right? So if you guys would, if in the chat, think of an Amazon type business, but for tools. What is some important data? If you just had to guess without asking, what is the important data, if lost, stolen, whatever, that caused the greatest impact to the organization? Thank you, Cactus, for the picture of the wrench there. Nice. Any comments? See a couple people typing. Supplier contracts. So the price, I'm going to guess, I'm going to sort of expand on these. I'm just taking a guess here. So supplier contracts, how much am I buying the tools for? Oh my gosh, this was one of the big things. If I can figure out how much a competitor is paying for stuff, and if I'm paying more, I might be able to get my price down, right? Customers, who are their buyers? Because maybe I can market to those specific ones. Customer inventory, how much information I actually have on hand. Very good. PII, right? This could be information about my employees, information about my clients here as well. Design schematics, I like that answer. They didn't actually build anything, so cool. Cost of goods sold, cool. Some more financials, yeah. I didn't see credit card information. The answer that I got, and dang it, Mike, I think you ruined it. The answer that they told me was the price at which they sell things. The pricing, Mike got it first. No one ever gets it right. Dang it, Mike. I'm glad you work with me, Mike, smart guy. But the price at which they sell things. And I was like, when they told me this, in my mind, I am holding back so much sarcasm. I was like, guys, this is on the internet. Just so you know, everyone on the internet can see the prices because it's on the internet, right? And like in my mind, I'm like, kill the sarcasm, still the sarcasm. I was like, I just said, and he just saw me just with this blank look, and the wheels are turning, and probably fluid dripping out of my ear because I was just confused and I didn't know what to say and not be sarcastic. But he's like, yeah, if a competitor can get the price at which we sell our stuff, all they have to do is undercut us by a single cent, and we're out of business, right? Because a bolt is a bolt is a bolt, right? If it meets the same specs, if it's the same grade, who cares? I was like, huh. I mean, I get what you're saying, but like, how do you protect that? And he talked about this profiling of people. This was a long time ago, way before we had all the crazy captchas and stuff. But they would profile customers and change the pricing. It was awesome. I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. But I asked the question, and during that test, we actually came across that pricing data in a database. And if I hadn't asked that question, I would have seen this data and been like, so what? It's on the internet. Who cares? Right? But now, because I asked the stupid question, that dumb question, the question that I felt like an idiot for asking, it changed the entire results of our pen test. It changed all of the vulnerabilities that led to that specific point. So always, 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 always ask that question. And if you're not comfortable with it, just say, look, I don't like to be wrong. I'd rather ask and have you tell me the answer that I already know than be wrong, because I really, really hate being wrong. I actually learned that trick from Steve Sims. So we talked about this a little bit before too. I'm not going to hit it too much, but domain admin, as we talked about, it's a tool, right? This is not the end case. Our goal isn't to get to domain admin, right? Our goal is to get to the data. And Jeff McJunkin, Tim Malcolm-Vetter have some great quotes on that. Because it happens if we go to domain admin, maybe we trip something as a tester and get caught, but we're actually on the wrong path. Whereas if we had stayed on the path, focusing on the data, not on that quote win. Don't get me wrong. I love that quote win, and it is ingrained in my head that I need that win. I need that domain admin. But what you got to do is say, focus on the data. Now, once you get the data and you demonstrate impact, cool, come back then, and then get the domain admin, but focus on the data first, right? So think about this. If the attacker is going after some sort of intellectual property, let's say those design plans somebody mentioned before, if they land on the engineer's workstation, do they need to pivot? No, because that engineer has all the information that they need. They land on finance's computer, and finance has access to the money. Do they need to pivot? Nope. There's no reason we need to move to domain admin to demonstrate that risk, right? So focus on the data, keep that as the target. Domain admin could be a cool little kind of fun thing at the end, but focus on the data first. All the risk should be surrounding that data, not the domain admin. All right, so let's talk now, and we'll get into our part 4 here. So let's take all these pieces together, right? So we sort of kind of trashed our traditional internal pen test a little bit, talked about some of the basic assumptions that we made and a little bit why it was faulty. We talked through what are the real attackers doing, and then we discussed the focus of our test, right? What we should be targeting. Let's take that. Let's take all those pieces. Let's combine them together now, and let's sort of rebuild our tests, right? So, a great article. I've been reading a lot more since I don't know, February, when I've been home a lot more. And I was reading. Actually, I think it was on a podcast first, but the Harvard Business Review had an article on 3 ways to improve your decision making, and I read that and I was like, all right, I know how to make a good decision, right? But just in case, let's see the other mistakes other people make, right? So the first one said, the first item was be less certain. Huh, okay. Be less certain. Overconfidence is a significant bias here, right? And we've probably all run into that insecurity. Well, that's never going to happen to me. I'm certain of it. Yeah. Are you, right? Like, and we'll say like, we've got this such and such tool that'll prevent this. This will prevent this other attack. Yeah. But what if it doesn't? Now, the funny thing is, according to the research behind this, they found that more successful monetarily wise, you were more likely to have this as an issue, being overly certain. Also, men. Now look around our industry, right? And I'm not trying to get into sort of the whole gender thing, but this is the stats. If you are well compensated man, which is frankly the large portion of our audience, you are more likely to be overconfident than the rest of the population. And I was like, oh, that one hurts. That stings, right? 2, ask how often this typically happens, right? So this goes back to the, hey, is it going to happen to you? No, never going to happen to you. No one's ever going to attack us. Okay, cool. What do you think the chances of it happening to someone else are? And they'll be like, oh, I'm going to say 30%. Cool. But why aren't you part of that 30%? Right? I was reading another great book by Nobel laureate Danny Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, and it talks a lot about these sort of mental disconnects that we have sometimes, where it doesn't apply to me, but it applies to everyone else, but we're part of the set of everyone, right? Like, why do we have this sort of a disconnect, right? So ask that too, like, okay, so let phish happens, right? Be less certain. Let's say it does happen. It's a 30% chance for everybody else. Why isn't that the same number here, right? So, and then do some basic probabilities here as well, some basic math, not just the, hey, it isn't going to work. Oh, that's very nice of you, blind hacker. One day I want to be just like Tim. No, you can be better. All right. The access via ODay. So this is an interesting discussion. I've had this with a number of people. I don't want to throw names around, but you've probably heard of a couple of these folks. But the sort of discussion here is like, well, it's not a real test if you can't phish your way in with an ODay. Okay, so I could spend a pile of money or hire people or find people who are going to, they're going to find these ODays and then I'm going to use them for phish, and then I get in. Cool. I spent a pile of money. Now these ODays, these 0 days, they are going to happen. What if we just assume, like, let's just say it happened, right? Let's save tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars on this initial 0 day and just say, let's just start here, right? Anybody that's done, our Discord channel has gone to hell. So you completely lost me now, folks. Right? So we got this 0 day, and we need to use this now to get into the organization. Right? This is very expensive. Anybody now remember my train of thought? Anybody that's ever done a red team, the most frustrating and boring part is the initial phish. Right? You send the email in and you wait. And you wait. And then you're thinking like, hey, is Steve on vacation? Is Susan out for the week? Right? Did he get caught by their filter? Did they just not click it? Right? There's a whole bunch of waiting, not to mention the development of the payload up front. Right? What happens then if with that sort of a test, even if we do use a real sort of ODay, what happens if there's some sort of compensating control that catches that specific ODay? Is the whole test invalidated? Do we miss everything behind it? Right? So I think this sort of focus on you have to ODay it. Yeah, it's a cool buzzword. It's an awesome, fun thing to say, but do you want to get value most efficiently as possible? Or do you want the cool buzzword, right? And kind of going back to this a little bit as well, I love red teams. It is so much fun. But almost every single client we get, anybody I talk to, I ask them like, look, do you really want a red team? I mean, we'll give it to you, but are you asking because it's the cool sounding word of the day or because you actually need it? We were just talking to, again, that same sort of client yesterday. We've got a very red assumed breach where we're actually going to work with their internal offensive team. The offensive team is going to give us access to a couple of systems, and we're going to start from there and try to hide from the defenders. But it saves that upfront effort and time trying to get that initial piece, right? Get that initial access or something like that. And it just makes things a lot more focused. And we can focus on the important parts, right? Focus on, hey, can your defenses stop us? Can your defenders see us? Right? Don't get me wrong. I love the red teams. I don't want to necessarily talk you out of them, although I kind of do. But what's our goal here, right? What's the important piece, right? So with our assumed breach here, what we can sort of do is we've got our sort of our couple of pieces here. Is we're going to assume that our attacker has access, right? We're going to go back to our decision-making process and say, look, let's assume the phish happens. Maybe it's an insider, maybe it's that phish, right? But let's start at this specific user, right? We can use that. Now the attacker is on the network and they have access as that particular user, right? So we've got access as that user. Now, as that user, we can start looking around the network because that user exists in the organization because they have a job to do. Might not seem like they're actually useful, right? We've all worked with those people before, but they have access. And in every single organization that I've ever seen, I'm sure Mike and Corey can back me up here, we have always seen extra sensitive information lying around. Now, it's not all of the data, but some of the data. And as a bad guy, I don't need all the money. I would like some of the money, right? And it sort of ties us back here to focus on the data. Again, we don't need all of the data. We don't need the domain admin. We need some of the data. I was doing a test, gosh, this is a little over a year ago now, and we did the assumed breach. And their endpoint tools were fantastic. We had a hell of a time trying to pivot. Escalation was brutal and just stuck. And we ended up looking around and finding financial information on a number of systems. Now, this is a financial institution where you have to have like $10 million to even knock on the door. Right, so think about this from an attacker's perspective. How many $10 million do they need to be happy? Right? I don't know about you, but if you said, look, is $10 million, is that good enough? I'd be like, yeah, sure, fine. Totally okay with me. Right? So they don't have to go to the central where everything is and get billions, be super happy with just 10 million bucks. So we see this time and time again where the data is quite literally littered throughout the organization. This is actually a blog post that Mike did, redsiege.com/goal, where he talks through a very similar situation. This actually, I think these happened very similar time frame. Actually, his was a little bit before mine, I think, but very similar time frame where a hell of a time trying to get access to the network, trying to escalate, trying to pivot. And we just went to ground and started looking around like, hey, what's out there? And in Mike's case, now this is not actual client data because we like NDAs and not getting sued, but there was other financial stuff floating around that network. Again, focus on the data. If we just focus on that domain admin, just focus on that privilege escalation, in both cases, we would have been hosed. Now, when we focus on that data, we can now demonstrate some of that risk. If you want to do some of this, we've got the Power View There's the very long link. By the way, the links are all clickable in the slides if you want to grab the slides. If you don't like to download the slides, you can just grab it at redsiege.com/powerview. And you can grab the power view there. Now you do need to grab the dev branch. The master branch does not have this particular function. At least it hasn't for the longest time. Maybe they'll update it by the time some of you view this online later. But the function that we're looking for here is the find interesting domain share file. Yes, long name for the commandlet. It used to be find file shares. No, it's something shorter. But they keep making it longer and longer and longer. What this will do is say, hey, let me look around the network. Give me all the shares. Let's start ripping through the shares. And let's look for files with specific text in the name of the file. So there's some of the basic information. Mike's actually in the next presentation going to go much deeper into a number of these tools here. Right? Other great things. Good old sysvol, time and time again. In fact, that one test I was talking about where we had a really tough time escalating, we found an old credential for a domain administrator as a script on a sysvol, right? And this is one of those places you're like, of course I would look there. Yeah, but this is one of those situations where any user, any computer can read sysvol. Right, where my traditional pen test, I would have to get a credential before I could do anything here. This is already out there for all sorts of users. And most of the time when we find a credential out on sysvol, it's gonna have privileges because it needs to run absolutely everywhere, right? We also got some GPP. Those are all some fun ones. Technically, this has been deprecated, but the function, sorry, the XML entry, the entity is still there in many organizations. In fact, I think Corey was working on a report like 2 weeks ago, came across it, or maybe it was Mike, I forget who it was, came across this. Yes, so Minion posted it. The old commandlet, the old function was called find domain share, not find interesting domain share file. Like I just keep adding more. All right. Great tool there. Again, we can use PowerSploit to get our GPP password. There's so many P's there, I get confused. And then one of my favorite tools, invoke Kerberos. Love me some Kerberos. We've got a whole presentation all about attacking Kerberos that we'll probably do in probably 2 months or so. I need to get that out and get that recorded and get that up online where we can talk through some of this. But what we're going to do with Kerberoasting is get tickets. We'll then use those tickets because the tickets are encrypted using the password hash of the target service. We can then essentially get password material, crack that, and then access that target system, right? Other fun things to do is spray for passwords, right? Once I've got access to the network, get a list of password users, and we can start using some of the passwords. Of course, the great ones are season and year, because every 90 days, everyone has to change their password. Because when Moses came down from the mountain, he had a third tablet. And on that third tablet, it said, "Thou shalt change thine password." No, I'm just kidding, right? No, it's been 90 days because it's been 90 days. And users, if you've ever worked the help desk on January 2nd after Christmas and New Year's back to back, January 2nd is miserable because everyone's calling to reset their password. So people, of course, use things like the season and year, or they'll use the company name, F-bomb company name. Local sports teams, especially this time of year, we haven't had sports for 6 months. You're going to see a lot of sports teams in passwords right now if they're doing password rotation. Keyboard walks, especially in government organizations. Try some of these. And again, I don't have to get all of the passwords. I just need that single one. And of course, I'm sure you've heard this sort of beaten, talked about bad passwords all the time. I don't mean to beat this dead horse once again. Tremendously useful. Abusing some of the mailbox permissions. So maybe our user has access to other mailboxes. We can check those mailboxes, look for sensitive information in those mailboxes. I'm sure Plenty of people have passwords in email, right? Or the sensitive documents, right? I send the document over to somebody. There's the document. There's that sensitive data. We don't have to pivot. It's probably already in their email. We can use this lovely tool here, something like Open Inbox Finder. Open Inbox Finder, great tool for that, right? Cool. All right, so we're gonna wrap it up here. Let's take a look at some of the questions. By the way, as I'm checking for questions, by the way, Justin, if you want to come online and read some of those, that'd be great. We've got all the offensive services. Feel free to reach out to us. Also, if you want to talk to us, we can follow up with you. If you just go to the chat and go to and just type !Red Siege, we will reach out to you and contact you. Otherwise, contact information is here. Grab us on the slides. And with that, let's go to questions.
So Tim, you must have done an amazing job explaining things, because we technically at this moment have 0 questions.
Score.
I know. We got some people typing, injections typing, but not a question. I think you covered everything expertly, as if you were a teacher.
It's funny, after the last presentation, that it's like, that was like a SANS presentation. I'm like, well, I mean,
Yeah.
for SANS and I write for SANS, so I feel like if it wasn't.
No,
Okay, here's a question from the Laughing Man. So how much data do you consider to be enough during an engagement? Is there a point to where you say, okay, we have enough to show our point, or do you go as far as possible to show a larger impact? Interesting question. Kind of like you were saying, only one account for the 10 million, but small enough to satisfy the needs of the client. Yeah, so I'm trying to answer this. So I think what we can say is, look, if there's a systemic issue, like in a situation that both Mike and I encountered, we saw it was a systemic issue where we saw sensitive client data, their client data, all over the network, right? And it was enough to call that out and be like, look, you have a systemic issue. Now, we didn't stop at that point. We keep looking for other paths and other data. But we definitely do write that up. It was a higher severity because it wasn't a one-off in either of our cases. This was a regular occurrence where you could see that for some reason people were setting up shares on their computer so that they could share this client data, and it was accessible to everyone because they did it that way. All right, so Proto, why don't you DM me a size? They do run a little bit small, so I would suggest size up. We do have ladies cuts who run quite small, so size that up ×2.
We have a question from the go-to.
Okay.
Ever run into a management's disagreement on assumed breach model? How would you approach this problem? This is from Jay Lito.
Yes, I have. And it's tough. I mean, because if someone's sold on their ways, you're gonna have a difficult time. But and assuming you're talking about like the red team versus, if you can follow up with some additional clarification there. My assumption is the piece that they're getting hung up on, and I'm saying this assumption because this is what I've encountered as the biggest hang up, is people are like, well, but it doesn't count because it's not a real O-Day. And I'm saying is, well, let's assume it is, because that real O-Day is going to happen. In fact, I could find one and develop one and do the same thing. Guess who's going to pay for it? Right? You're now going to have to pay significantly more to use that O-Day because the life is only so long. Also, I've got the additional liability. If I use a 0-day on you and I start using it in other customers, what happens now if somebody else catches that 0-day? Right? I've essentially sort of unleashed this upon the world, and then there's potential issues there, right? Like that's a whole other sort of a presentation. My short answer is, let's just be more efficient. Let's save money, and let's just start a little bit later. A typical red team is 6-person weeks. Typical assumed breach is 1 or 2 weeks, right? You've got a significant budget difference that you could spend on training, tools, eventually personnel. Anyways, so that's my. If you've got follow-up questions, please by all means chuck it in the chat.
So it looks like Corey and Mike are handling sticky bits questions. So Wardock says, when you're working with an insider for assumed breach, where is a common entry point that you are dropped on?
Oh, that's a great point. I don't think I covered that much. So one of the important pieces, if you're doing an assumed breach, we always ask, can I have a laptop or a VDI for a recently separated employee? Or and ideally the count from that recently separated employee. And the reason is everybody knows the first couple weeks of work, your first job, the first thing you're going to do is, hey, I don't have access to this. And eventually people start giving you access to the things you're supposed to have, right? So if I get that clean system with that clean account, it doesn't represent what's actually going on inside the organization. So we like to have a real laptop and that real account, so we've got a better representative sample to show, hey, look, there's some issues here, right? Because we're on the same team. People are like, that's cheating. No, it's not. We're on the same team, right? Like my goal is to find the vulnerabilities so that you can stop them so that we can keep the real bad person out, right? So try to get as real as possible with that. I don't want an admin, because then you're starting a little bit too far. I mean, you could do that kind of a thing and say, hey, look, do we have detections for our admins? Who knows?
Minion has one. While checking for account lockout and domain password spray, it restricts the spray, which has only one attempt remaining. So let's say some accounts already has one attempt left. Wouldn't it get locked out already while running that domain password spray?
No. So what that's, and I think I'm reading your question correct. So if there's only one attempt left on the account, it skips that account. So let's say that the lockout is after 5, it will only, if it's at 4 attempts, it's not gonna do that 5th one to lock that account out. So in a way though, you run the risk of missing a valid finding because you're trying to reduce the risk to the organization. And frankly, I'm okay with that because account lockout, especially anything that's wide scale, can be a significant issue.
Did we mention this? Little Pony says PowerSploit's pretty much burnt out. Any good alternatives? Did we talk about that yet?
No, what was the?
Little Pony just says the question is PowerSploit is pretty much burnt. Are there any good alternatives?
Yeah, so that's tough because these tools are, I mean, PowerShell, if you use it on a test, by and large is more often than it used to, just PowerShell itself is going to get you burnt. Right, so some of these pieces we have to do maybe a little bit more purplish sort of aspect. There's also some of the, I'm trying to remember if Seatbelt has it. Seatbelt with GhostPack is C# that does a number of the checks from some of the other tools. I don't remember if it has that specific piece built in or not.
All right, from GoTo, this is Kurt Pomeroy. Are you guys focusing much about tripping alarms and avoiding detections when doing internal pen tests using the assumed breach scenario? Or do you just hammer away and if there's an alert, then that's good and something positive to note on the report?
The answer to that is both, right? So it depends. We've done both. So it comes back to what are you trying to test? What is your goal? And frankly, what's your budget, right? The faster I can go and the louder I can be, the faster I can go, which means it's going to take less time, which means, of course, less money, right? But the goal there then is to test the technical aspect, right? We have one, I mean, the one I was talking about just a little bit ago, it's a very red assumed breach. We're going to essentially, they're going to cede to us that initial access and then say, hide. Go slow and hide and try to get to the sensitive data. So the answer, I don't have a great, this is the answer. It depends on your goals, right?
All right, you got a couple more. Cactus. How about compiling code on box to evade? Win10 comes with compiler and is not normally blocked logged.
Yeah, you can do some of that to do your own custom compiles. Way too often, just removing some of the strings, the text from some of the executables is enough to bypass antivirus. Jeff McJunkin had a really funny one where there's a couple of strings he took out of Mimikatz and it got past like almost everything. I do see a question over here from Curb N40. Does DPAT look at password login account? DPAT is an analysis tool afterwards. It doesn't actually do the guessing. That's a tool I think by Kerry Roberts, right? But that's more for the analysis aspect.
And at that
Mike is saying yes, absolutely, with the compiler and custom compile. Yep. Now, if you're just grabbing the code and doing the compile, I mean, computers do the same thing. That's their job, to do the same thing over and over again. So you got to make some changes so that your compilation is different from mine, right? Change some of the text around, change the function order, change the name of functions to try to hide. Cool. All right, we have another shirt to give out. Who's this? Another shirt here. Let's do. All
right. I think we should. He made a point. This is true. So in the slide, I didn't catch it when I read through it. You have leech author, not lead author, in your second slide, which was called out by Tup48 in the very, very beginning. I think it's worth. Yeah, look at your second slide, the one that talks about you. I didn't even notice it either when I went through it. Yeah, the one that says I'm Tim Medin. Yeah, right there. So I think Tup48 deserves one for pulling that out. He got that real quick. Laughing Man's got a question.
With work from home growing, have you attempted any assumed breach scenarios with recently separated employee count over VPN or externally? Yes. I mean, I can't think of the specific one, but yes. Yeah. Simple answer is yes. We're seeing a lot more. So I got a friend of mine who works a lot more in the IR side. And what's interesting with the work from home is, of course, he's dealing with a lot more ransomware. People are opening things up like RDP to the internet, and we're seeing bad guys getting in and ransomware, all of the fun things. So there's a lot more access mechanisms that shouldn't be access mechanisms. Oh, there we go. Yep. With work from home, how are you handling people's personal networks and equipment in terms of sensitivity? What we're not doing is intentionally going back the other direction. We use those credentials to go in, not to get to the end user's systems. Does that make sense? So what happens is, like, for example, we've got a laptop on site. Literally today, we're talking to a client, and it was from someone who had left. They had plugged that laptop inside the network, and we just RDP into it like a regular user, or we're supposed to. We don't have access yet, but that's a whole different thing. When will I write a book? Oh gosh, writing is horrible.
You're a leech author.
Yeah, I'm a leech author. I could be yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's it.
All right, cool. Well, thank you all for attending. Again, we will have the slides are up now. Don't forget, register for the next one with Mike, redsiege.com/AB2, where he's going to go into a little bit more technical depth here to give a little different perspective on it. So check us out on 8/18. What day of the week is that? Is that a Tuesday as well?
Same thing. Yep.
Tuesday. Cool. So check us out there. Again, feel free to reach out to us on the tweeters. I need to get off this slide because it's got all the wrong infos. But feel free to reach out to us if you've got questions, comments, thought. And of course, we like work too. So good deal.
All right. Well, I guess that's it. Thanks, guys. Now I just got to remember how to stop this thing. Is it this button? All right. See you guys later.